So, you want to learn languages? I got you! Aren't you tired of trying to learn languages but never quite getting anywhere really? Because that was me. Let me tell you, I'm not naturally talented at learning languages. My first language is Italian, and until 10 years ago, I couldn't really speak English at all, nor any other language. I would see all of my friends in high school just putting in the work and being so much more talented than me, and they were able to express and communicate fluently. And meanwhile, I was studying every single day, I was putting in the work, I was reading the grammar book. So I was trying to do my very best and study as much as I could to ace my exams, and yet I could never quite do it. And then I found myself on my year abroad, and all of a sudden I noticed I really couldn't say anything else other than, "Hi, how are you?" My communication skills were non-existent. From that day, I decided something had to change. I did not want that to be me. I wanted to be able to communicate with people because traveling is one of my favorite things in the world. Once I decided to change, I came up with a system, and it really changed the way I was able to learn languages and integrate it in my daily life without it being overwhelming, because I am quite a busy person. I'm an astrophysics major, so I have to spend the majority of my time working on problem solving and other things. And afterwards, I started my first job, and that was taking a huge chunk of my time. So obviously I had to find a way that would bring me closer to my goals without being too overwhelming. Today, I want to share a little bit of those secrets with you. So right now, I'm able to speak 6 languages. I am completely fluent in 3. I have a very high level in the 4th one, and I've been learning the other 2 for the past year and a half. This is on top of my other commitments, my full-time job, and my studies. So how can you do it? So the first thing that I would recommend is try to have some grammar structure. You don't need to go overboard with it. You don't need to do something that is extremely hard or try to memorize different kinds of books. No, you just need just a little bit of a structure, a little bit of a framework to understand how the sentences are put together. And that can be done through online learning, YouTube videos, a book if you prefer. I personally like online lessons. They just allow me to have a little bit of a structure in my head to understand, okay, these 2 things are supposed to go together. But truly, you don't need that much grammar, because after you go through your first step, everything else becomes kind of more automatic. So you should just have enough grammar to give you a head start, just to understand how things work in a general sense without looking at the specifics. If you're trying to learn multiple languages at the same time, I will advise trying to stack together languages that are very similar to each other. So for example, the 2 languages that I'm learning right now are Korean and Japanese. One of the reasons why I started learning them together was not only because I'm really interested in them, but also because they have a very similar grammar. So whenever my Japanese teacher, for example, is trying to explain a concept, after a few days or a few weeks, my Korean teacher will also try to explain a very similar concept. Maybe the particles or maybe the pronunciation of the word will be different, but the gist of it will be similar enough that it will allow me to make the connection between these 2 things and remember them much easier. I'm allowing myself to do spaced repetition without actively putting any extra effort in it, because it just happens naturally. So if you're going to learn multiple languages at the same time, I highly recommend you pick them logically. One of the biggest tips that I could ever give you is to forget about your goal. Truly forget about your goal. And the reason is, the more you start thinking about languages as a goal that you have to achieve, the more you start focusing on, I have to reach, A2 level or B1 level or C1 or whatever by a certain amount of time, the more your brain will start considering it as a chore. And the more friction it will start giving you on your way to that particular goal. The way to avoid that is to simply stop thinking that you have that end goal and just let the language learning do its course, because obviously it's gonna take time. The less expectations you have for yourself, the quicker you will see you will grow, because you have less pressure and you will start making it an actually fun process and not just another one of your daily tasks, because it doesn't have to be, truly. It's easier to make switches to your daily life so that they are naturally integrated and you up your exposure. When I talk about not having a goal because otherwise it become a chore, it also means, please do not expect to improve all of your language learning abilities at the same time. Your speaking, your writing, your reading, and your comprehension, they won't be all equally easy to learn. For example, learning to read and to write in Japanese is much harder than learning to speak and to comprehend, because obviously you have so many kanjis to learn. The most important part about learning a language is actually being able to communicate with other people. So I would say focus at the beginning on your speaking and your comprehension and your listening. That way you will actually be able to, put sentences together. If you haven't aced every single part of your target language yet, you will, but the important thing is to get you going and to build that momentum as quickly as possible. And that leads me to my next point, which is obviously full immersion, as we all know, is the easiest way to learn a new language. There is nothing that can beat it, but yeah, not many people have the ability go to a different country and to be exposed constantly to a new language. So what do? Well, the best way that I personally found is to up your exposure every single day through small daily changes. So for example, if you're going to watch TV, then switch the TV program to your target language. And then at the beginning, you're gonna have subtitles, obviously. And then as time passes, you're gonna turn off those subtitles. And then eventually, you're gonna turn on the subtitles in your target language so that you're reading and you're listening at the same time. If you're going to read a book that you're gonna read for pleasure, like for example, Harry Potter, Sherlock Holmes, whatever, read it in your target language. At the beginning, it's gonna be so hard because obviously reading a book, it's such a monumental task in a different language. But then, little by little, you will find that, oh, I'm actually enjoying this book and actually understanding more than I'm supposed to. The task is actually quite enjoyable. Or, for example, if you have your daily commute, instead of listening to music or instead of doing nothing, you could either read a book in your target language while you're on the train, or you could listen to a podcast. You know those talk in the target language only podcasts? You could just use one of them and listen to it for even 15 minutes a day. It really doesn't have to be that long. It could be 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Those 15 minutes, 30 minutes repeated every single day over a long period of time, they're going to make a big difference. Another really easy one is to just change your phone language from your main language to your target language. If you want to focus on your writing, you could keep a journal. Instead of doing your daily journaling, if you do daily journaling in your native language, you could switch to your target language and just do a task that you will anyway do in your target language, so you're learning at the same time and it's not taking you any extra time. If you can just identify these ways to up your exposure and increase your efficiency daily, I promise you, your language learning abilities will skyrocket and you won't even notice it. The other common method that I wanted to talk about is flashcards. I am personally not that much of a fan of flashcards when it comes to language learning, because I think that just learning one word doesn't mean that you're able to apply it in context. But what I would say, especially when you're at the very beginning stages of learning a language, you will need those 500 words that will allow you to build, more complex phrases. So just at the beginning, yes, I would use flashcards, but I will also say it's much easier to remember the content of a flashcard if you have them physically. If I'm using physical flashcards, I'm associating the visual memory of looking at the card, the hearing memory of hearing myself talk, the kinesthetic memory as well, in the process of picking up the flashcards and reading it. All of that makes it much easier for me to remember the content. And after you learn those very first words that you need, I will move on to put those words in context. The other one that everybody talks about, but obviously I'm going to mention as well because it's truly the most important things to learn vocabulary fast, is to learn the words in context. So flashcards we use for the very first words. So I would say 200 to 500 words max. And then we switch to words in context. And that is because learning words in context is literally the most important thing about learning a language. That's really how you make connections. That's really how you learn and you never forget vocabulary. That can be by listening to something that is themed or reading to something that is themed, or just, again, if you're going to talk like I do, just talk about something that is contextual. But also when it comes to the words itself, trying to understand what's the meaning behind that word. For example, let's say that over here I have a flashcard with the Korean word 안녕히 계세요, which basically means goodbye to the person who is staying, from the person who is leaving to the person who is staying. So I have a choice here. If I were to just use my flashcard, I will just learn the sentence itself, 안녕히 계세요. If I want to learn it in context, I will have to split it into these component parts. So I will know that it's formed by 안녕히, which means to be at peace, and 계세요, which means to stay but formally. So if I had learned the whole sentence by itself, I will only be able to use it as goodbye. But because I haven't, and because I actually try to make it more contextual, I can use the first part and I can recognize it in different sentences, like for example, 안녕하세요, or the second part, which means to stay. I know that I'm going to recognize it every single time I have to say something related to staying, but in a formal way. And context obviously means very different thing. It doesn't only have to be related to, a particular topic. Obviously, if you're learning the words in the context of a particular topic, it's gonna help. But context might also mean just making association with pictures or sounds or colors or whatever. It just means to make associations with it. The more associations you make, the better. The type of association will depend necessarily on what type of learner you are. For example, for me personally, I'm not that much of a visual learner. So if I were to just, draw a picture and then have the words in it, I would probably not remember it. I'm much better when I listen to something. So podcasts, for example, or YouTube videos where I can listen and watch are much more effective for me. So try and find a way to make connections that really works well for you and with the kind of learner that you are. If you can try and up your exposure to all kinds of connection, obviously the more connections you can make, the more association you can make, the faster you're going to learn. Also, if you're going to use flashcards, please focus on a very small batch of words, because you might say, and I'm also guilty of this, I do this every single time even though I know it, it's just to think to myself, okay, I only need like 1,000 words to start, having simple conversation in my target language, so I might as well just try to learn these 1,000 words. It doesn't seem like such a big number at the end of the day. I'm sure that I can do it in a few months. You're gonna get overwhelmed. Like, you can do it if you have nothing else to do. You can do it if you don't have a full-time job. You can do it if you're not studying full-time. If learning your language is truly your one goal, aim, and focus, don't do that. Focus on just a very small chunk of those words and repeat them consistently. If you only pick like 5 new words a day, in 300 days, that's 1,500 new words. That's more than what you said at the beginning, more than the 1,000 words that you wanted to learn at the beginning. And I only counted them for 300 days out of 365 days of a year, because I'm counting days where you will be sick, you won't be able to do your revisions, for revision in bulk, where you want to revise all of your flashcards together, for days where you just don't feel like it, and then you will actually be able to remember, because in those 65 days you have been able to repeat them and to revise. So keep it small, very small steps at regular intervals every single day if you can, and small switches are much more effective than burning yourself out and ending up hating the language that you're learning, because this is supposed to be fun and we are supposed to create as little resistance, as little friction as possible. You also need to talk from day one, and I know this is the hardest part about learning a new language, because it's so embarrassing. At the beginning, it's so embarrassing. You don't know what you're doing. You're making mistakes left and right, and you don't really know how to communicate properly. And you get and grow so tired of, your friends or the international people that you met through apps to talk with constantly correcting you, and it gets exhausting. The good news is you don't have to do it immediately. You don't have to do it immediately with somebody else, because you can always talk to yourself. And I do this all the time. I will just go around the house doing my house chores, and I will just be saying out loud everything that I'm doing in real time. And I try to do it in my target language, so nobody has to listen to me, but I'm practicing. I'm practicing without wasting any time, because I'm cooking, I'm going through my day, I'm at home alone, nobody's really paying attention to me. And if I have to look up a word, I will just pick up my phone and open the dictionary and the embarrassment is gone, because the only embarrassment I'm gonna feel is with myself, and that's fine. And then obviously afterwards, once you practice enough and once you're comfortable enough, you might actually want to make the switch and try to use a language learning app, or try to find a teacher or somebody you can converse with. And there are plenty of apps where you can find international students or international learners. Just remember that the more mistakes you make, the faster you learn, and that nobody's there to judge you. Honestly, props to you for wanting to learn a new language, truly. Like, if anything, the fact that you make mistakes, it means that you are actually pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and you're doing something for yourself, so props to you. The other tip that I have is for more advanced students, probably. I understand that it's not something that everybody will necessarily want to integrate, but I found that it's really, really helpful. I didn't do it for every language, but now that I'm getting better at it, it's something that I just trying to do regardless. It's something that I started to do when I started learning Spanish, because I was in an international school and my Spanish teacher didn't speak Italian. They didn't speak my first language. And I know that like Spanish and Italian can be quite similar in pronunciation, but they just walked in the first day of class speaking in Spanish, and I didn't speak a single word of Spanish. Nobody did. So I had to force myself to learn one way or another, otherwise I was failing all those classes. So what I used to do on my way back from my high school to my house was thinking in Spanish. And that is, I would just push myself to, instead of thinking about the thoughts that I was going to have anyway in my native language, I would try to have the same thoughts but in my target language. So in those 10 minutes that I would walk from my high school to my house, I would basically practice so much, because I was just thinking in my target language. People believe that thinking in your target language is something that has to be very advanced. It doesn't have to be. You can make very simple sentences with the vocabularies that you do have and that you do know. It's not about making extremely complicated sentences with very fancy words. It's about being able to communicate the necessary things that you need to in your daily life. If you try and push yourself to use that very limited vocabulary to activate that part of your brain that is linked to language learning, then you will start noticing that acquiring new words will become easier and easier and easier and easier. And that is because you're actually making connection, you're actively making connection. But again, you're doing that while you're thinking. So you don't need to dedicate any particular amount of time, you don't need to dedicate a particular space to doing that. You can do that while you're doing literally anything else. Yes, obviously it takes a little bit of activation energy to get things started, but I truly find that it's much better to just, sitting at a desk for hours on end, just memorizing grammar and then not really going anywhere. And then finally, eventually, if you just keep sticking to these habits, you will find that one day, 1 year from now, you will find that video, you will find that podcast, that clip that you listened to 1 year ago and you couldn't understand anything. And all of a sudden you will realize, I get it now. I understand most of these words. I get it. And that will be one of the best moments you'll experience throughout this whole journey. This is it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it and I really hope you enjoyed it. I try to keep it a little bit different. I try to cover topics that I haven't necessarily heard many people talk about, but genuinely these things are the ones that help me the most in my language learning journey. So I wish you the best of luck on your language learning journey and I'll see you very soon. Bye bye.